The train that carried Private Jack Ellison east out of Kansas rattled like an old skeleton. The men inside were all young, loud, and full of guesses about what waited beyond the Atlantic. Some still wore their civilian shoes. Their helmets sat crooked on their knees. Outside the window, America rolled by. Barns, empty fields, water towers painted with names of towns no one would ever remember. Somewhere up ahead was New Jersey, and beyond that, a war. Jack had never seen the ocean. He was 19, thin as a fence post, and had grown up plowing dust and watching newsreels about Europe like they were someone else's bad dream. Now that dream had his name on it. The sergeant called them green as spring grass, which was true enough. Their rifles were still heavy in their hands, their boots stiff, their movements clumsy. The manuals they'd memorized back at Camp Blanding told them how to march, shoot, and salute, but not what it would feel like when someone was trying to kill you. When they finally reached England in early '43, the first thing they noticed was the mud. The second was the discipline. British soldiers drilled them on fields that felt centuries old, where every step sank into wet clay. The Americans laughed at first, calling it playing soldier in the fog. But after a week of crawling through rain-soaked trenches under live fire, no one laughed anymore. The training officers, some veterans of North Africa, watched them closely, taking notes, changing formations, adjusting doctrine. The Army was still learning what it meant to fight in Europe. Jack's platoon practiced moving in fire teams, a concept that had been new once. The sergeants explained that the war was changing. The enemy didn't line up like they did in the old manuals. The Germans moved fast, hit harder, and vanished before the artillery could answer. The Americans needed to adapt. Instead of marching shoulder to shoulder, they learned to spread out, to move by cover, to trust small groups to act on their own. Each man learned to read terrain, to make choices without waiting for orders. By the time they shipped to North Africa, the Army had begun to understand that wars weren't won by divisions. They were won by squads. Tunisia taught that lesson in blood. Jack's first firefight lasted 30 seconds. The Germans were dug into a ridge with machine guns that chewed through the sand like saws through wood. The platoon advanced just as they'd trained. But when the shooting started, the world dissolved into chaos. Men hit the dirt, shouting, firing blind. Jack couldn't hear anything but the crack of rounds over his head. When the sergeant finally waved them forward, it was one man at a time. Crawl, shoot, move, repeat. The manuals hadn't said how much courage it took to crawl into a storm of metal. That night, when the shooting stopped, they sat among the rocks and counted who was missing. The platoon leader was gone. So were two friends Jack had played cards with the night before. The survivors smoked in silence, and the sergeant said, "We'll do it better tomorrow." And they did. Each day, the Americans grew quieter, sharper, more deliberate. They learned to flank instead of charge, to use grenades like punctuation marks in a deadly language. When they finally pushed the Germans out, the victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like survival. Months later, back in England, they trained again, this time for something enormous. The talk was of beaches and cliffs, of a continent waiting to be reclaimed. Jack had been promoted to corporal now, his face thinner, his eyes older. He watched new replacements arrive, fresh from the States, laughing the same way he once had, and he tried not to think about how few of them would make it home. The officers drilled them on combined arms tactics, something the Army had barely understood in 1942. Infantry would no longer advance alone. Every move would be covered by armor, artillery, and air. Radios crackled with new coordination. The Army was learning to fight like a machine, each part dependent on the others. The night before D-Day, Jack lay awake aboard the transport ship, staring at the metal ceiling. Around him, the men murmured prayers or tried to sleep. Outside, the sea heaved under a black sky. He remembered his first sergeant's words, "We'll do it better tomorrow." and realized that tomorrow had finally arrived. When the ramp dropped at Omaha Beach, everything he'd learned collided with reality. The first wave was slaughtered. The second almost broke. Jack's squad hit the surf waist-deep, bullets stitching the water around them. The tactics drilled into them, bounding fire, cover movement, collapsed in the chaos. The beach offered no cover, no coordination, only raw will. Men crawled behind obstacles, yelling orders no one could hear. Jack found himself beside a shattered tank trap, firing at muzzle flashes on the bluff. Then a lieutenant, a kid younger than him, shouted, "Up the beach! One man covers, the rest move!" It was madness, but it was the only thing that worked. They moved in bursts, crawling and sprinting through smoke. Each man trusted the other's rifle more than his own heart. That day, tactics became instinct. The manuals had never shown this, but they had built the habits that kept him alive. Hours later, the Americans clawed their way up the bluffs. When Jack finally reached the top, he saw the hedgerows stretching inland, dense, ancient walls of earth and brush that made every field a fortress. Normandy taught the army another lesson. Europe wasn't open desert or clean battle lines. Every farm, every lane, every tree was a fight. The platoon learned to adapt again. The old fire team formations were useless in the hedgerows. The officers studied the terrain and invented new tactics on the spot. Engineers strapped explosives to poles to blow holes through the brush. Tanks fitted with hedgerow cutters plowed narrow paths. Infantry began to move with tanks in ways no manual described, close enough to touch, signaling with hand gestures and shouts. Artillery became precise and personal, called in by lieutenants with radios who could barely hear over the gunfire. By late summer, the Americans moved like hunters instead of herds. Each squad had learned how to think independently, how to fight in fragments, and still stay united. The army that had landed in France was not the same one that had sailed from America. It was leaner, smarter, harder. Jack saw the difference every time a new batch of replacements arrived. The rookies asked about rules, about how things were supposed to work. The veterans just told them, "Watch, learn, move when you feel it." War had become intuition, a rhythm built from survival. At St. Lo, the Americans broke through after weeks of fighting hedgerow to hedgerow. Jack's squad advanced behind tanks that spat fire into the green walls. They cleared farmhouses room by room, grenades first, rifles second. When the Germans counterattacked, the response was automatic. Machine guns set in crossfire, mortars zeroed in within minutes. The Army's coordination had become near perfect, born not from theory, but necessity. Jack watched as officers began using smoke rounds to mark positions for fighter bombers. Air support responded within minutes. A dance of steel and sky. Every victory now was built on communication, not command. The Army had learned that orders mattered less than understanding. By the time they reached the Siegfried Line, winter was closing in. The men were ghosts of themselves, thin, pale, worn to the bone. But their movements were fluid, wordless. Each squad knew exactly how to take a pillbox, how to clear a trench, how to survive one more day. Then came the Ardennes. The snow fell heavy, muffling the world. The Germans struck hard, their armor punching through weak points in the line. The army that had once moved like a machine had to learn how to fight, scattered, isolated, surrounded. Jack's company held a crossroads near Bastogne, cut off from supply. They dug in, fought with whatever they had left. The new tactics, flexible command, fire and maneuver, were the only thing keeping them alive. When the weather broke and the sky filled with American planes, it felt like the earth itself exhaled. Earth itself exhaled. As the winter turned to spring and the Americans crossed the Rhine, Jack realized the Army had become something unrecognizable from the one he'd joined in 1941. The lessons had been written not in books, but in blood. Small unit initiative, combined arms, adaptability. These were no longer theories, but instincts. When the war finally ended, Jack stood on the banks of the Elbe and looked east, where the smoke of Germany hung over the horizon. Around him, men laughed, cried, stared in silence. He thought of the boys who had come with him from Kansas, most now buried under white crosses. He thought of all the lessons learned too late. He didn't know it yet, but historians would later say the American Army had reinvented modern infantry warfare in 4 years. Jack didn't care about that. He just knew he was still alive. And that, after everything, felt like the only victory that mattered. The wind coming off the Elbe was sharp, full of ash, and the scent of something ending. Jack Ellison leaned against a shattered tree and watched the river move like slow glass. The Germans were finished. Everyone knew it, but the killing hadn't stopped yet. Small groups still fought from basements, barns, and the ruins of towns that had no names anymore. The Army's maps were full of red marks, but the men just called them places we have to get through. The Army had changed so completely that the transformation was almost invisible. What had once been a collection of amateurs was now a living organism, each squad moving like a nerve, each man knowing his role without being told. Radios buzzed constantly with fragments of coordination. The phrase "on my command" had almost disappeared. Now it was "on your judgment." Jack's squad was proof of it. There was Doc, who could stop a man from bleeding with one hand and fire his M1 with the other. There was Riley, who'd figured out how to spot German snipers by the glint of sunlight on their rifle scopes. And there was Sergeant Miller, who'd long ago stopped giving speeches. He just said, "Move when it feels right." They did, and somehow it always worked. The last weeks of fighting were strange. Part victory, part exhaustion, part disbelief. They advanced through villages where white flags hung from windows, through streets littered with broken furniture and children's toys. The people looked at them with hollow eyes, some grateful, some numb, some too empty to care. The Americans gave them chocolate and cigarettes, then kept walking. None of it felt like triumph. Jack noticed how the tactics had evolved into something effortless. Every time they entered a town, the routine unfolded like muscle memory. Scouts went first, tanks covered intersections, machine gunners took rooftops. The coordination was silent, almost graceful, born from repetition and trust. There were no more grand charges, no more confusion, just efficient, deliberate motion. He thought back to 1941, to the training grounds where they'd practiced those ridiculous close-order drills under the Florida sun. He remembered how awkward everything had been, how slow, how uncertain. Now, in the ruins of Europe, the same men moved with a precision no manual could have taught. It wasn't about orders anymore. It was about instinct, about reading the ground and knowing what to do before anyone said it. One morning outside Magdeburg, the platoon came under fire from a line of trees. The sound of German MG-42s ripped through the air, an old, terrible rhythm. But there was no panic now. Jack's men dropped, spread out, and answered like clockwork. 2 riflemen laid suppressing fire while Riley flanked wide, crawling through a drainage ditch. Miller called in mortar fire using nothing but a hand signal. Within minutes, the fight was over. The enemy position was gone, the ground theirs again. Afterward, Miller just nodded. "Good work," he said. That was all. No cheering, no speeches. They all knew what they had become. Fighters shaped by 4 years of mistakes and survival. That night, they bivouacked in a farmhouse that still smelled of smoke. Someone found an old phonograph, and for the first time in weeks, music drifted through the dark. A German lullaby, haunting and slow. Doc poured coffee into tin cups, black as tar. "You realize," he said quietly, "we're better soldiers now than the day we landed. But I don't think we'll ever be this kind of soldier again." Jack didn't answer. He was thinking of the men they'd lost, of the lessons bought too dearly. Every tactic, every maneuver had a name attached to it. Someone had died discovering it. By late April, the war was ending fast. Rumors spread: Hitler dead, Berlin surrounded, the Russians closing in from the east. The Americans stopped talking about tactics. They talked about home. Miller told them they might be part of the occupation. Jack tried to imagine being a peacekeeper instead of a fighter, and couldn't. The last firefight came without warning. A German truck convoy tried to break through a roadblock near the river. Jack's squad reacted automatically. Riley's bar opened up, grenades arced through the air, and the trucks stopped in a storm of fire. When it was over, Jack found a boy no older than 16 lying beside a burned-out vehicle. His uniform didn't fit. He still had milk on his breath. Jack stared for a long time, then turned away. There was nothing left to say about war. When the surrender finally came, it wasn't dramatic. Orders arrived by courier: cease operations, hold position, prepare for transition. The men stood by the roadside, smoking in silence. Someone muttered, "That's it?" and someone else laughed. The front, which had been their entire world, just dissolved. Weeks later, the army began to pull back toward the Rhine. The machinery of war slowed, then stopped. Soldiers who had lived in motion for years suddenly had nothing to do but wait. They cleaned weapons that would never fire again, drilled out of habit, talked about going home. The tactical brilliance that had carried them through Europe now had no purpose. Jack walked through one of the captured towns alone one evening. The air smelled of spring, faint and new. Children were playing in the ruins, chasing each other through the rubble. He thought of all the tactics, all the training, all the lessons, how it had begun with confusion and ended in mastery, and how none of it could bring back the men who'd taught it to him. When his discharge papers finally came, he folded them carefully and slipped them into his jacket pocket. The journey home felt unreal. The ship was quiet. No singing, no celebration. Just tired faces staring at the horizon. On deck, Jack watched the Atlantic roll beneath them, dark and endless. Somewhere out there were the ghosts of every battle they'd fought. When America appeared, gray coastline under morning light, some men cried, others stood silent. Jack felt nothing at first, just an odd emptiness. The war had given him everything and taken almost everything else. He went home to Kansas. The fields were the same, the wind the same, but he wasn't. Sometimes he'd catch himself scanning the horizon, imagining hedgerows or machine gun nests where there were only fences and corn. The habits of survival never left him. Years later, when his son asked what the war had been like, Jack didn't talk about heroism or glory. He said, "We learned fast. That's all." He told him how the army had changed, how it had gone from marching in lines to fighting in teams, from shouting orders to trusting instincts, how men had learned to think for themselves, because in war, thinking was the difference between living and dying. He said that America hadn't just built tanks and planes, it had built a new kind of soldier, and that soldier had carried the fight from North Africa to the heart of Germany, not because he was told to, but because he understood how. When Jack grew old, he kept one photograph on his mantle, his squad standing in front of a Sherman tank, mud on their boots, smoke behind them. No smiles, just the calm of men who had seen everything and survived it. Beneath it, written in fading ink, were the words, "We learned. We adapted. We endured." Sometimes, when the wind rattled the windows, he could almost hear Miller's voice again, quiet and certain. "Move when it feels right." And he would close his eyes and see them all. Doc, Riley, the others, moving through the fields of Europe like shadows, spreading out, covering each other, the rhythm of their training and trust echoing across time. The war had ended, but the lessons never did. The years that followed the war moved differently. For Jack Ellison, time didn't march. It drifted. He traded his rifle for a hammer, his helmet for a sun-bleached cap. The rhythms of farm life replaced the rhythms of battle, but the instincts never left him. When he walked his fields, he still caught himself glancing toward the horizon as if expecting movement. Sometimes the low rumble of a passing tractor made him flinch before his mind caught up. At first, the memories came at night. He would dream of hedgerows that never ended, of smoke that refused to clear. He saw faces, heard Miller's voice, felt the familiar weight of his rifle in his hands. The war wasn't gone. It had only gone quiet. In the years after 1945, the Army changed again. Jack followed the news in the papers. New uniforms, new divisions, new doctrines. The word pentomic appeared in headlines. Talk of mobility, flexibility, atomic readiness. He recognized the pattern. The Army was still learning, still adapting, just as they had in those muddy fields of Normandy. The difference was that now, the lessons were being written down instead of lived. When he received an invitation in the mail from the War Department in 1950, an offer to attend a reunion and discussion on infantry experiences in the European theater, he hesitated. In the European theater, he hesitated. Part of him wanted to forget. Another part needed to know that what they'd done hadn't just faded into the noise of history. He went. The conference was held in a hall filled with officers, professors, and men with clipboards. They talked about small unit leadership, fire and maneuver, combined arms doctrine. Jack listened, half amazed, half amused. Everything they said with slides and charts he had once learned in dirt and fear. When one colonel stood up and declared, "The squad is now the foundation of all infantry tactics," Jack smiled faintly. He remembered Miller saying the same thing in a ruined barn with artillery falling outside. Afterward, a young officer approached him, eyes bright with curiosity. "Sir," he said, "you fought in Europe? What was it really like?" Jack thought for a long time before answering. "It was learning," he said finally. "Every day. You learned what worked, what didn't, and who you could trust. The Army grew up in that war. So did we." The officer nodded, but Jack knew he couldn't really understand. You couldn't teach fear, or the moment between decision and death, or the strange calm that came after. But he appreciated that the young man was trying to learn. That was something. As the years turned to decades, the world changed again. New wars came and went. Korea, Vietnam, places Jack couldn't even pronounce. He watched them on television, the color images unreal and sharp. He saw soldiers moving through jungles, fighting in small teams, using radios, calling in air support the way he once had. The uniforms were different, but the rhythm was the same. It comforted him, in a way, to know that what they'd learned hadn't vanished. Sometimes he would sit on his porch and think about how far things had come since those first days in 1941. Back then, the American infantryman had been a farm boy with a rifle and a manual. By 1945, he had become something entirely new, a tactician in mud-stained boots, trained to think and act with independence. It wasn't just the weapons or the training that had changed, it was the mind behind them. He once wrote a letter to an old comrade, Riley, who had settled in California. In it he said, "We started out thinking war was about bravery. We learned it was about understanding. The ones who survived were the ones who adapted first." Riley never wrote back, but Jack later learned he'd kept the letter folded in his wallet until the day he died. In 1961, when a new generation of recruits began training under doctrines derived from lessons of World War II, Jack was invited to visit Fort Benning. He walked the training grounds, watching young soldiers move through obstacle courses with practiced precision. The instructors called out commands that sounded familiar, but sharper now, honed by years of refinement. One sergeant handed Jack a cup of coffee and said, "We still use your war as the blueprint, sir. Everything we teach starts there." Jack laughed softly. "We didn't write a blueprint," he said. "We just tried not to get killed." But as he watched them train, bounding forward, covering each other with automatic fire, calling out clear, disciplined movements, he realized the sergeant was right. Their instincts, their courage, their mistakes had become the framework of something lasting. On the flight home, he looked out the window and thought about the distance between then and now. The boys who had once crawled through North African sand had unknowingly written the manual for every soldier who came after. Their sweat and terror had turned into doctrine. Their scars had become structure. He grew old quietly, tending his land and his memories. The medals stayed in a drawer. What he kept close was a map of Europe, creased and stained, with pencil marks tracing every place his squad had fought. Sometimes, when the evening light hit it just right, he would run his finger along the route, from Tunisia to Normandy, from the Ardennes to the Elbe, and feel the weight of all those miles. When Jack Ellison finally passed, his son found among his papers a small leather notebook. Inside were short entries, written in a steady hand. They weren't about battles or medals. They were observations, simple truths distilled from years of war. Cover is life. Movement beats fire. Think for yourself. Trust your team. Learn faster than the enemy. And the last line, the only real tactic is survival. At his funeral, the local Veterans Honor Guard stood at attention, rifles gleaming in the sun. Among them were men who had fought in Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq. None of them had known Jack personally, but all of them were heirs to the lessons he and his generation had carved out of chaos. After the ceremony, his son placed that worn notebook inside the folded flag. "He taught you how to fight," he whispered. "You just never knew his name." Somewhere, beyond the Kansas horizon, the wind carried the sound of rustling wheat. The same sound Jack once heard in the fields of France, mingled with gunfire and shouted orders. The war was long over, but its rhythm had never stopped. Because every soldier who crouched behind a wall, every squad that moved by instinct, every commander who trusted his men instead of his manual, was living proof that the lessons of 1941 to 1945 still endured. Wars would change, weapons would evolve, but the heart of the American infantry, the adaptability, the courage to learn in chaos, the trust between men who shared danger, remained. That was the true legacy of the European theater. Not just victory, but evolution. And in that legacy, somewhere beneath the turning earth of two continents, the voices of the old soldiers still whispered their final doctrine. Quiet, timeless, and true. Move when it feels right. The years rolled on, and the world Jack Ellison had fought for grew faster, louder, and more complicated than anything he could have imagined back in those cold European winters. Yet even as cities changed and wars took new shapes, echoes of that old struggle still reached him. They came in the form of newsreels, grainy documentaries, and the letters from young soldiers who somehow found his address. Some wrote to thank him, though he never saw himself as a hero. Others asked what it felt like to be in the middle of a war that decided the world's direction. Jack always gave the same answer. It felt like doing what had to be done, he'd write. The rest came later. But the truth was, part of him missed it. Not the killing, not the fear, but the sense of purpose that war had given him. In 1944, every sunrise had meant survival. Every man beside him had been family. After the war, that kind of clarity disappeared. Life became 1,000 shades of gray again, and Jack sometimes longed for the sharpness of those days, when choices were brutal, but simple. He visited Europe once more in the 1970s. It had been nearly 30 years since he'd walked through France, yet the air still smelled faintly of soil and smoke. Normandy was green and quiet now, fields stretching to the sea like nothing bad had ever happened there. He stood near Sainte-Mère-Église, where paratroopers had once hung from church steeples, and he thought of Miller, Riley, and the others. The locals had rebuilt everything. The roads, the homes, even the hedgerows. But Jack could still see the ghosts. He walked through the remains of an old farmhouse, where he remembered taking cover from German artillery, and he imagined his younger self crouched there, caked in mud, shouting over the thunder of shells. For a long while he said nothing. Then, quietly, he murmured, "You'd like it this way, Miller. It's peaceful now." Later he found a small museum in a nearby town. Inside, behind glass, was an American M1 Garand. The plaque read, "Standard Issue Rifle of the United States Infantry, 1941–1945. Jack stared at it for a long time. He knew its weight, its balance, the way it kicked against your shoulder, the metallic smell of oil and powder after firing. To anyone else it was an artifact. To him it was memory, heavy, human, and alive. Heavy, human, and alive. The curator, a young woman with careful eyes, noticed the way he looked at it. "Were you there?" she asked in halting English. Jack nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "All of it," she smiled. "Then thank you." He wanted to tell her that thanks weren't necessary, that the war wasn't something to be proud of. It was something to remember, to learn from. But he just smiled back. Some lessons couldn't be explained in words. When he returned home, Jack spent his final years writing. Not stories, not memoirs, but notes. He wanted to leave something behind for the next generation of soldiers who would face battles he couldn't imagine. He wrote about leadership, fear, and the small, invisible decisions that determined life or death in combat. In one of his last letters, he wrote, "The manuals will always change, but people don't. When you lead, remember they follow not your rank, but your courage. When you fight, remember the goal isn't to destroy, it's to survive long enough to end the fight." In his final months, Jack sometimes sat on his porch with his grandson, a quiet boy of 16 who loved to ask questions about the old war. Jack never glorified it. He spoke of men who froze in foxholes, of the smell of cordite, of the strange beauty of dawn after a night bombardment. One evening, as the sun fell over the Kansas plains, the boy asked, "Grandpa, were you scared?" Jack looked at him for a moment and said, "Every day. But fear's not the enemy. It's the thing that keeps you moving. The trick is to keep learning faster than the fear." That night, when the boy went inside, Jack stayed out on the porch, looking up at the stars. He thought of all the soldiers he'd known who never came home, and how the army had changed because of them. Every improvement in training, every manual rewritten, every officer who now understood the power of trust and initiative, that was their legacy. When Jack passed away quietly one winter morning, the Army sent a small honor guard, not for his rank, he'd never been more than a staff sergeant, but for what he represented, a bridge between eras, a man whose war had reshaped how others would fight and survive. At his graveside, his grandson placed Jack's worn dog tags beside the folded flag. Then he whispered, "You taught them how to fight smart, Grandpa." And maybe that was true. Maybe that was how history really worked. Not through generals or speeches, but through the slow, stubborn courage of men like Jack Ellison. Men who had learned, under fire, that victory wasn't just about strength. It was about adaptation, about thinking when others froze. Long after the mourners left, a gust of wind rolled over the field, bending the grass in slow waves, like soldiers advancing across an invisible battlefield. Somewhere, far away, thunder echoed faintly. Or maybe it was just the memory of distant guns. The world Jack had helped shape moved on, but the lessons he'd lived remained. Every time a young squad leader made a split-second decision under pressure, every time a soldier thought for himself instead of waiting for orders, every time a commander trusted his men's instincts, that was Jack's war still living on. And though the rifles had changed and the battlefields had new names, the heartbeat was the same. The rhythm of learning, adapting, surviving. That was the legacy of the American infantry from 1941 to 1945, not just victory, but evolution born from necessity. And in that evolution, in every foxhole and forward push that came after, the spirit of men like Jack Ellison quietly endured, unseen, unheralded, but everlasting. Spring came early the following year. The Kansas fields bloomed with color again, and time, as it always did, carried everything forward. Jack Ellison had been gone for months, but his presence seemed to linger in quiet places. The empty porch swing that creaked when the wind shifted, the faint smell of pipe tobacco in his old study, the dented steel helmet resting on the bookshelf. His grandson, Michael, couldn't bring himself to move any of it. Every object seemed to hum with a kind of memory. One evening, Michael sat at Jack's old desk. The drawers were neat, military neat, except for one near the bottom that stuck a little when he pulled it open. Inside were stacks of folded papers, yellow with age, held together with a faded ribbon. At the top was a letter addressed to "Whoever finds this may be a soldier someday." Michael unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was steady, bold, the same he'd seen in Jack's field notebooks. It began simply, "You can learn a lot about a man by how he digs a hole." In 1942, I didn't know that. We dug shallow and wide because we thought the war would move fast. By 44, we dug deep, narrow, and quiet. Because we'd learned it was going to take everything we had. It wasn't a story, not really. It was a lesson, a record of what had changed and why. Jack had written about how tactics weren't born from generals' orders, but from the mud, the fear, and the trial and error of men on the ground. How the early days of rigid formations and textbook maneuvers gave way to small unit independence, fire teams learning to think on their own. How the Army learned, painfully, that initiative was more powerful than hierarchy. Michael read for hours. He read about North Africa, where Jack's platoon had first realized that the manuals didn't prepare them for dust storms or ambushes from invisible guns. He read about Sicily, where the men began moving in pairs instead of lines, trusting each other more than the orders shouted over radios. He read about Normandy, how they'd stopped relying on sweeping advances and started fighting inch by inch, house by house, using grenades like punctuation marks in a brutal new language. But what struck him most wasn't the description of battles. It was the way Jack wrote about learning. Every fight taught us something. Every loss was a classroom we didn't ask for, but couldn't ignore. The Germans were masters of defense, so we learned patience. We learned silence. We learned to see war not as noise, but as rhythm. To listen for the gap between the machine gun bursts and move in that heartbeat of quiet. Michael closed the letter, eyes wet. He'd grown up hearing about heroes and medals, but this was different. It wasn't about glory. It was about growth, the kind that came from pain and persistence. He decided then that his grandfather's words shouldn't stay in a drawer. Over the following months, he began typing them out, line by line, preserving every misspelled word, every underlined sentence. When he was done, he added only one title at the top: Lessons in the Mud. Years later, that small document found its way to a military academy library. Cadets read it between field exercises, surprised that a staff sergeant, not a general, had written something so profound. One instructor called it a soldier's gospel of adaptation. Another said it was the best description of tactical evolution he'd ever read. And so, the lessons that had begun in the hedgerows of France lived on in classrooms and training grounds, carried not by the sound of gunfire, but by quiet reflection. Sometimes, during field drills, a young officer would quote a line from the old text, "The best plan in the world won't save you if you can't change it halfway through." And someone would nod and say, "That's Ellison's line." No one knew much about him, just that he'd been there, that he'd written from the mud, not the map. His words had outlived his voice, passed on like an heirloom. One summer afternoon, decades later, Michael visited the Military Museum in Washington, D.C. In one of the newer exhibits, Infantry Tactics of the Second World War, he saw something that made his heart stop. Beneath a glass case lay his grandfather's M1 Garand, the same one from that small museum in Normandy. Next to it, mounted on a brass plate, were a few lines engraved from Lessons in the Mud. War isn't about who shoots first. It's about who learns faster. The soldier who adapts survives. The one who refuses to change writes his own ending. Michael stood there for a long time, hand pressed against the glass, smiling through tears. The museum was silent, except for the hum of air conditioning and the soft footsteps of visitors. Somewhere behind him, a father was explaining to his son how the American infantry became the most flexible fighting force in the world. But Michael knew it wasn't just about the army. It was about people, about how his grandfather's generation had been thrown into chaos and had built order out of it, not because they were told to, but because they had to. As he turned to leave, he caught one last reflection in the glass, his own face, faintly overlapping the steel of that rifle. For a moment, he imagined his grandfather standing beside him, smiling the same tired, steady smile he remembered from childhood. And in that reflection, past and present seemed to merge. The echo of footsteps in mud meeting the rhythm of modern boots on polished museum floors. Outside, the flag over the memorial grounds rippled gently in the wind. The day was bright, and the air smelled faintly of rain and cut grass, like Europe in spring. Michael took a deep breath and whispered softly, "You taught them well, Grandpa." And far above, where sky met memory, the wind seemed to answer, a low, steady hum, like the distant roll of tanks moving forward into another dawn. In the decades that followed, the world changed faster than anyone from Jack Ellison's generation could have believed. Wars no longer looked like Normandy or Bastogne. Soldiers now carried devices that could see through walls, call in air support from satellites, and navigate foreign streets with digital maps glowing in their palms. But beneath all the technology, beneath the armor, the drones, the sensors, the same lessons Jack had written in pencil on yellowing paper still lived quietly at the heart of every training manual. By the time Michael's son, Daniel, enlisted, the war stories of 1944 had become chapters in textbooks. But to Daniel, they weren't history. They were inheritance. His grandfather's words had been read aloud at his high school graduation, and they had stayed with him. The soldier who adapts survives. He carried a small copy of Lessons in the Mud, folded into his rucksack, the pages laminated from wear, the ink fading from use. His first deployment was not in Europe, but in a dusty corner of the Middle East. The air was dry, the light harsh, and though the names and faces were different, the feeling of uncertainty was the same. When his platoon moved through unfamiliar terrain, ambushed from unseen ridgelines, or found themselves cut off from radio contact, Daniel thought of his grandfather's letters. He thought about how those men in 1944 had learned to trust instinct over orders, initiative over routine. One night, after a long patrol, he wrote in his journal, "The maps have changed. The enemies have changed, but the fear is the same, and so is the courage." Months later, after his tour ended, Daniel returned home. He visited Arlington National Cemetery on a quiet winter afternoon, snow crunching beneath his boots. He found his great-grandfather's grave easily. The white marble was simple, engraved with only a name, rank, and dates. The air was still, the sky the color of steel. He knelt, gloved hand brushing frost from the inscription, and spoke softly. "You didn't just teach them how to fight, Grandpa. You taught them how to think." A breeze rustled the nearby trees. The flags along the avenue trembled faintly. Daniel smiled. It felt as if the world had answered. Years passed, and time, as always, folded one generation into the next. Lessons in the Mud was eventually digitized and added to the U.S. Army War College archives. Cadets could now scroll through its paragraphs on glass screens, the words glowing softly in rooms filled with touchscreen maps and holographic displays. But the story itself, the voice of a young infantryman writing by candlelight in a French farmhouse, remained untouched. Historians sometimes debated the evolution of American tactics. They traced it through doctrine changes, leadership reforms, and battlefield data. But in quiet moments, many of them admitted that what truly changed the U.S. Army wasn't written in official reports. It was written in the dirt by soldiers who learned to adapt under fire, who learned that no plan survives first contact, and who passed that hard-won understanding down through generations. And so, from the beaches of Normandy to the digital battlefields of the 21st century, that same idea endured. That thinking, flexible soldiers win wars more surely than numbers or machines ever could. Michael lived long enough to see Daniel retire as a decorated officer. On his last day in uniform, at a small ceremony on a training field in Fort Benning, Daniel gave a short speech. He didn't read from notes. He just looked out at the young recruits standing in perfect formation, eyes wide, boots spotless, and said, "My great-grandfather fought in Europe with a rifle and a shovel. My grandfather fought with words. I've fought with satellites and screens. But we're all part of the same story, the story of learning, adapting, surviving. Remember this, technology will change faster than you can think. But courage and adaptability, those are timeless. Those are what keep you alive." When the ceremony ended, Daniel walked off the field and handed a small notebook to the youngest private in the company. Its pages were yellow, the writing faint but legible. "Keep it," he said. "You'll understand one day." The private nodded, tucking the notebook into his pack. And as the sun dipped low over the Georgia horizon, the light caught the worn leather cover. The title was barely visible now, but if you looked closely, you could still make it out. Lessons in the Mud. The book that began in a foxhole in 1944 had crossed a century. A bridge of words and wisdom spanning from the mud of Europe to the modern age. And as long as there were soldiers learning how to fight, how to lead, and how to think for themselves, the spirit of Jack Ellison, and all the men who learned the art of survival in that brutal, evolving war, would never fade. The world had changed, but the lesson had not, because in the end, every battle, whether fought in forests, deserts, or mines, came down to the same truth that one soldier had written long ago: adapt, endure, and remember. That's how we win. At dusk, the world turned gold. The wind rolled softly through the tall grass outside Arlington, bending it like waves on an unseen ocean. The sky above was streaked with crimson, a color that once meant fire and fear, now only memory. A bugler stood alone by the flagpole, his uniform crisp, his eyes distant. When he lifted the trumpet and played taps, the sound rose like a whisper through time. Michael and Daniel stood side by side, 3 generations apart from the man who had started it all, their faces lit by the fading light. The air felt heavy with ghosts, not haunting, but present. Quiet guardians of lessons learned too dearly to be forgotten. Daniel held the old notebook in his hands, its edges soft from decades of touch. He didn't open it. He didn't have to. Every word inside was already alive in him, in every soldier who had ever looked fear in the face and kept moving. He placed it gently on the grass at the base of the memorial and stepped back. As the last note of the bugle drifted into silence, a breeze moved through the trees, stirring the pages of the notebook just enough to make them flutter, as if someone, unseen, were turning to the final page. And there, written in fading pencil, was one last line Jack Ellison must have added near the end of his life. It wasn't about war, or victory, or tactics. It was something simpler. We learned how to fight, but more importantly, we learned how to be human again. The light dimmed, the flag settled, and for a moment, it felt as if the whole world had paused to listen. Not to the noise of history, but to its heartbeat. Generations would come and go. Wars would change shape and name, and machines would grow smarter than the men who built them. But courage, compassion, and adaptability, the quiet trinity that had carried Jack Ellison and his brothers through the mud of Europe, would remain. Because the story of the American infantry wasn't written in medals or monuments, it was written in the dirt, in the sweat and fear of ordinary men who learned, under fire, that survival was not about being strongest, but about refusing to stop learning. As the sun slipped below the horizon, the field darkened, and the last light caught the edge of that worn leather cover. The words glowed faintly, for just a moment, as if the book itself were alive. Lessons in the mud. Then the light faded, and all that remained was the soft sound of wind and the endless whisper of grass. The eternal echo of men who had once fought, learned and lived, shaping the future not with power, but with understanding. And somewhere far beyond the stars, where memory turns to legend, Jack Ellison walked once more through the quiet fields of Normandy. His boots leaving no prints now, only peace, adapt, endure, remember. The story was never about war. It was always about what came after. It was always about what came after.